Ready to dive into literary theory. It's a fascinating challenge you've given us.
It really is. But luckily, we have a great guide in Jonathan Culler and his book, Literary Theory, a very short introduction.
Think of it like we're exploring a maze, and Culler's our trusty map. So where do we even begin with this whole literary theory thing?
Well, it's not just about analyzing symbolism or memorizing a bunch of isms.
Right, it's not like we're back in a college lecture trying to decode the hidden meanings of a teacup in a Jane Austen novel.
Yeah.
So what is it really about then?
It's about challenging those common sense ideas we have about books and meaning.
And even reality itself, right?
Uh-huh.
Culler doesn't shy away from the big questions. He jumps right into the deep end with, what is theory anyway?
And it's such a great question because it gets at the heart of what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand why a certain symbol might give you goosebumps while someone else just sees a tree or a bird. What are those underlying mechanisms shaping our reactions?
It's like how some people can get completely lost in a novel and others just see words on a page. So how does theory help us explain that?
Theory provides us with the tools to dissect those reactions, to understand the how and the why. It's about analyzing the ways we make sense of the world around us, through language, storytelling, even our own identities.
Speaking of identities, I was blown away by Culler's examples from Foucault and Derrida. Like Foucault's idea that we created the category of sex in the 19th century.
It's a mind-bending concept, right?
It is, because it's not like intimacy didn't exist before the 1800s.
Exactly. Foucault isn't saying that biological sex is a modern invention. He's highlighting how our understanding of sex as this defining category, the way we talk about it, categorize it, use it to understand ourselves, all of that is a product of our social and historical context.
So you're saying our understanding of those biological differences has always existed, but how we frame those differences is fluid.
Precisely. And it's not just about abstract ideas. These shifts in language and categorization have real-world consequences, shaping how we understand ourselves and others. Think about how the Victorians suddenly medicalized certain behaviors, labeling them as hysteria or sexual inversion. Those weren't just neutral descriptions. They were used to control and regulate people's lives.
It's like how our digital identities barely existed before smartphones. Now our online presence feels as real as our physical bodies. It makes you wonder what future generations will make of it all.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that leads perfectly to another point. Culler tackles how we define literature itself, which surprisingly is way more complex than you might think.
Right. It seems like it should be obvious.
Yeah.
But Culler compares it to defining a weed. Is a weed inherently weedy, or is it just a plant someone decided they didn't like in their garden?
Exactly. It's all about context and perspective. So with literature, is it about using elevated language? Is it about the context in which it's presented? Or, as Culler suggests, is it about the kind of attention we pay to it?
I love that he uses the example of a sentence from a fortune cookie versus a line from a poem. Depending on how it's presented, how we approach it, even a simple sentence like, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, can take on a whole new meaning.
Context is everything. A throwaway line in a fortune cookie might make you chuckle, but that same line framed within a poem could spark genuine introspection. That's coming about it. Culler's point, literature isn't just about passively reflecting the world, it actively shapes how we see it. It's all about framing.
That reminds me of how a vintage lunchbox is just a rusty old box, unless it's displayed as this nostalgic relic from the past. Suddenly it's a collector's item.
It's all about the story we tell ourselves about that object.
And that's why we get those aha moments when we're reading, right? Those moments where it's like, wow, I've never thought of it that way before.
Exactly. It's the power of stories to make us question our assumptions and see the world from different perspectives.
It's like how a good book can stay with you long after you've finished reading it, prompting you to see the world with fresh eyes.
And that power of perspective shifting is a great segue to Culler's exploration of the relationship between literary studies and cultural studies. You know, at first glance, they seem like two sides of the same coin.
Right. They both explore culture, so where's the tension?
It's the lens they use, really.
Yeah.
Imagine a telescope versus a microscope, right? So literary studies are like that microscope, zeroing in on the intricate details of a single text, painstakingly analyzing its structure, those little nuances, how it all comes together to create meaning.
Okay, I'm with you.
Cultural studies, on the other hand, are more like the telescope. They pan back to examine how literature functions within this bigger picture of social, political, even economic forces. It's about seeing the forest, not just the trees.
So cultural studies look at the whole context surrounding the creation of literature, right? and how people engage with it in a particular time and place.
Exactly. And, Culler, he's got a great sense of humor about this whole thing.
Oh,
He points out that this focus on the broader context often leads to, and I'm quoting here, professors of French writing books about cigarettes or Americans' obsession with fat, Shakespeareans analyzing bisexuality, experts on rap music dissecting the latest trends in hip-hop.
okay, I see where the humor is. It's like suddenly anything is fair game for analysis. We're not just stuck in those stuffy classrooms debating the symbolism of a teacup in a Jane Austen novel anymore.
Right. It's about saying, hey, let's look at how reality TV reflects our deepest anxieties about, social status and consumerism, things that don't scream literature at first glance.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
But when you put it that way, it makes you realize that even those seemingly superficial forms of entertainment can reveal a lot about our culture, right?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the literariness, so to speak, of all sorts of cultural phenomena. Take documentaries that dissect pop culture, for example. They analyze how music reflects social trends, or how recurring themes in movies reveal something about our evolving ideas about gender roles. That's cultural studies in action.
It's fascinating. It's like you're saying that to truly understand a work of literature, we can't just analyze it in isolation. We have to consider the cultural soup it came from,
Right.
the historical context, the social norms, the political climate. They all play a role.
You got it. And Culler even brings up it's surprising at first, but the example of professional wrestling to illustrate this point.
Wrestling. Okay, I've got to hear this.
He talks about how cultural studies look at the rules and conventions of a particular activity. So, a boxing match operates under a very different set of rules than a wrestling match, right?
Finally. One's a lot more theatrical, for sure.
Exactly. But both are forms of entertainment that have their own unique codes to communicate meaning. They're both telling stories in their own way.
It's like comparing a sonnet to a haiku, right? They
Right.
both involve words, rhythm, and imagery, but their rules and conventions produce completely different effects.
Exactly. But whether it's poetry or wrestling, we're drawn in by the drama, the struggle, that desire for victory.
The human experience at its core.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of cultural studies. It helps us unpack those seemingly simple things like a wrestling match, and suddenly you see all these layers of social messages and power dynamics woven into the spectacle. This shift towards cultural studies really pushes us to rethink what literature even is.
It's like Culler says, in principle, then, cultural studies includes and encompasses literary studies, examining literature as a particular cultural practice. It's not about replacing one with the other, but recognizing how they fit together.
Exactly. It's not a hostile takeover.
Right. So, will cultural studies end up absorbing literary studies? Or can the two coexist and even benefit from each other?
It's a big question. It's like, is this new kid on the block here to give literature a makeover or totally steal its spotlight?
Well, I can see how some people might worry that cultural studies will diminish the value of traditional literary analysis, right?
Right.
With its focus on what's considered high culture over low culture.
It's a valid concern. It's like, if we're analyzing, soap operas and what they say about social norms, does that mean we'll stop dissecting symbolism in Shakespeare?
Right. Is there room for both?
Well, Culler reminds us that cultural studies actually grew out of literary studies. They both use similar analytical tools. It's just they're focused on different aspects of culture.
It's like saying a chef and a gardener both need to understand soil, nutrients, how things grow. They have different specialties, but a shared foundation.
Exactly. Literary studies and cultural studies might be different branches, but they're part of the same tree, ultimately striving for this deeper understanding of culture itself.
And let's face it, the canon of literature has always been in flux, hasn't it? What we consider great or timeless literature has changed throughout history. It often reflects the values and perspectives of whoever's in power at the time.
Exactly. Culler even points out that those great works were chosen based on certain criteria at the time, right? Representing a specific literary movement, adhering to particular stylistic conventions, reflecting a certain historical period. It's all subjective.
So maybe instead of getting caught up in this definitive list of the best works, it's more about recognizing those most representative works from a given era, right? Works that give us a glimpse into how literature has shaped and been shaped by the world around it.
You're getting it. This is where the intersection of literary and cultural studies gets really exciting. It encourages us to see literature as more than just a collection of beautifully crafted sentences on a page, but as this dynamic force that both reflects and shapes the world around it.
It's constantly evolving, just like culture itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is where things get really interesting, because Culler throws us for a loop with this idea of performative language. Language is action. It's a whole new way of thinking about words.
It really is. We tend to think of language as this tool for simply describing the world, right? But Culler wants us to see that language can actually shape the world, that it has this power to do things.
Okay, so it's not just about what we say, but what we do with our words. It's like, remember that old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me?
Oh, absolutely. And I think Culler would argue that it's just not true. Words have incredible power. Think about it. Declarations of war, a judge's verdict, even a simple promise. They all have the power to change the course of events.
You're right. And this power of language is amplified in literature, isn't it? I mean, words create entire universes on those pages. Characters come to life. We feel their emotions. We get lost in the setting, all through the power of language.
Precisely. And Culler digs into this by exploring the work of philosopher J.L. Austin, who distinguished between what he called performative and constative utterances.
Okay, so remind me, what's the difference again?
So a constative utterance is basically a simple description, like, the sky's blue, pretty straightforward. But a performative utterance is an action performed through language. Like when you say, I promise, or I now pronounce you husband and wife, you're not just describing something, you're doing something with those words.
So it's like the difference between saying, it's hot in here, versus saying, could you please open a window?
Uh-huh.
One is stating a fact, the other is making a request, prompting an action.
Exactly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Austin argued that even some statements that sound constative can actually be performative depending on the context. It's all about how those words function in a given situation.
Oh, okay. So like how we were talking about the fortune cookie versus the poem, context shapes how language operates.
You got it. Like if you say, I love you to your partner, it means something very different than if you're telling your friend you love their new shoes. The words are the same, but the context gives them their weight.
And I guess that's what makes literary language so powerful, right? It's not about conveying literal truths, but about creating a world that feels true. It draws us in and makes us believe, even if it's just for a little while.
Exactly. It's about evoking those emotions, sparking the reader's imagination, making us feel like we're experiencing those events right alongside the characters. That's the magic of it.
It's the difference between reading a news report about a war versus experiencing that war through the eyes of a character in a novel. Both convey information, but the novel, it aims to make you feel what it was like to be there, to make it real, visceral even.
Precisely. And Culler takes this idea of performative language even further by bringing in Derrida, who was like the master of deconstruction.
Oh yes, Derrida. Always a mind-bending experience. What did he have to say about it?
Well, Derrida argued that in a way, all language is performative. He believed that every word we use is loaded with its own history, its own baggage even. Every word carries these echoes of how it's been used before in different contexts by different people. So even seemingly simple words, neutral words even, can have these layers of meaning embedded in them.
It's like each word is this suitcase packed with all these different meanings, some items carefully chosen, others tucked away in hidden pockets, representing all these different experiences and interpretations. It makes you realize that language is anything but neutral.
Right. And that leads us to another big concept. Culler explores identity. He really dives deep into how literature grapples with that fundamental question. Who am I?
Oh, that's such a big question. And it's one that we all grapple with at some point in our lives, right? Are we born with a fixed identity? Or do we create ourselves through our experiences, our relationships, the stories we tell ourselves?
Right. It's that age-old debate. Nature versus nurture. Are we predetermined by our genes? Or are we molded by our upbringing, our culture, the choices we make? And literature gives us this amazing space to explore all those possibilities without needing to land on a definitive answer, which is, I think, what makes it so powerful.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting how Culler highlights the role of feminist theory in all of this, particularly when it comes to challenging those traditional notions of gender. He talks about Judith Butler, who argues that gender isn't something we are, but something we do. It's a performance. Okay, so if gender is a performance, does that mean it's not real? Does that mean our biology is irrelevant?
Not quite. Butler's point is that while our biological sex is a real thing, our expressions of gender, those are shaped by all these social norms and expectations. It's about how we perform our gender through things like clothing, behavior, even the way we talk.
So you're saying our understanding of male and female is less about inherent traits and more about this set of costumes and scripts we've been handed. Like,
Yeah.
we're all actors on a stage, and society provides the wardrobe and the lines, but we have some freedom in how we choose to play the part.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of gender as performance, it helps us to see that identity is fluid, that it's constantly being shaped and reshaped through our interactions with the world around us.
So it all comes full circle. We started with this idea of language as action, and now we're talking about identity as performance.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize that we're not just passive bystanders in our own lives, right? We have agency. We have a say in how we define ourselves and interact with the world.
Exactly. And it's not just about our individual identities. It's about recognizing those broader narratives that shape our understanding of ourselves and the world. Those stories we tell about gender, about race, about power, they have real-world consequences.
It's like we talked about with cultural studies. Those expectations and norms are often reflected and reinforced by the media we consume, the stories we tell, even the products we buy. And I think that's what makes literary theory so essential, even today.
I agree. It gives us these tools to critically examine those narratives, to challenge the status quo, and hopefully to create a more just and equitable world.
And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the fascinating world of literary theory.
And what a deep dive it's been. We've covered so much ground.
We have. From questioning the very nature of literature and meaning, to unpacking the complex relationship between language, culture, and identity, this exploration has really challenged us to see the world and ourselves through new lenses.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that literary theory isn't just some stuffy academic pursuit. It's relevant to all of us. It's about understanding the power of stories, the ways in which language shapes our realities, and the importance of questioning everything. And on that note, I'd like to leave you with a final thought. If stories are so influential in shaping our identities and understanding of the world, what responsibility do we have, both as creators and as consumers of those stories, to ensure those narratives are inclusive, representative, and just? That's something for all of us to think about.